The lonely ranch house stood silently against the desert twilight when 3 black trucks crawled up the dusty road, their engines barely whispering. Inside, a team of cartel sicarios checked their weapons, confident this would be an easy grab. The target was just some rancher's wife, a quiet woman who spent her days tending horses. What they didn't know was that this humble ranch owner had once been the most feared gunslinger in 3 states, with a past written in gunsmoke and blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening sun cast long shadows across the Martinez Ranch, painting the adobe walls in shades of orange and red. Sarah Martinez stood at her kitchen window, her calloused hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee as she watched the dust devils dance across the New Mexico desert. 20 years of peace had softened her appearance, but not her instincts. Those remained sharp as ever, honed by years of service and countless firefights in places she'd rather forget. The sound came first, the subtle crunch of tires on gravel, engines running quieter than they should. Sarah's grip tightened on her coffee, a cup as she watched 3 black trucks appear on the horizon, cutting their lights as they approached. Her husband Eduardo was still out checking the fence line, blissfully unaware of what was coming. In all their years of marriage, she'd never told him about her past life, about the medals buried in a box beneath their floorboards, or about the real reason she'd chosen such a remote stretch of desert to call home. Sarah set her coffee down slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. The trucks were getting closer now, and she could make out the silhouettes of armed men inside. The cartel had been pushing into their territory lately, pressuring local ranchers to allow them passage through their lands. Eduardo had stood firm, refusing their advances and threats. Now they'd come to make an example. Moving with practiced efficiency, Sarah reached beneath the kitchen sink, removing the false panel she'd installed years ago. Inside lay a custom Colt 1911, modified with night sights and a threaded barrel, a remnant from her past life that she'd never quite been able to let go. The weight of it in her hands brought back memories of desert warfare and close quarter combat, of missions that never made it into any official record. The trucks came to a stop about 50 yards from the house, their doors opening silently as armed men emerged from the shadows. Sarah counted 12 of them, led by a tall figure she recognized as Miguel Ramirez, the local cartel lieutenant who'd been threatening Eduardo. They moved with the confidence of predators who'd never faced real resistance, their weapons held casually as they approached the house. Sarah positioned herself away from the windows, her mind already mapping out angles of fire and points of cover. The old skills came flooding back. Target prioritization, tactical movement, threat assessment. She wasn't just a rancher's wife anymore. She was falling back into the role she'd played for 15 years as one of the military's most lethal close combat specialists. "Mrs. Martinez," Ramirez's voice carried across the yard, dripping with false courtesy. "We've come to have a word about your husband's stubbornness. Why don't you come out and talk to us?" Sarah remained silent, watching through the gap in the curtains as the men spread out around the house. They were sloppy, bunching up in ways that would give her clear lines of fire. These weren't soldiers. They were thugs with guns who'd never faced a trained opponent. "Don't make this difficult, Senora," Ramirez called out again. "We just want to send your husband a message. Come quietly, and maybe we won't burn your pretty ranch to the ground." Sarah checked her weapon one last time, muscle memory taking over as she racked the slide. The familiar sound seemed to echo in the quiet house. She knew what was coming next. They'd try to break down the door, expecting to find a frightened woman cowering inside. Instead, they'd find something else entirely. The first kick landed on the front door, wood splintering as it burst open. 2 men rushed in, weapons raised, and that's when Sarah made her move. Years of training took over as she stepped out from behind the kitchen counter, her movements fluid and precise. The first two shots dropped the lead men before they could even register her presence. The sound of gunfire shattered the evening calm, and for the first time in 20 years, Sarah Martinez unleashed the warrior she'd kept buried for so long. Outside, she could hear Ramirez shouting orders, his voice tinged with confusion and the first hints of fear. He'd come expecting an easy kidnapping, but he'd walked into an ambush instead. Sarah moved through her home like a ghost, each step purposeful, each shot finding its mark. The cartel men were about to learn a harsh lesson about underestimating their targets, and Sarah was going to make sure it was a lesson they'd never forget. Chaos erupted as the remaining cartel members scrambled for cover, their confident demeanor shattered by the precision of Sarah's initial attack. Through the broken doorway, she could hear Ramirez barking orders in Spanish, his voice carrying an edge of panic that hadn't been there moments before. "Find her! She's just one woman!" he shouted, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Sarah moved like a shadow through her own home, years of CQB training guiding her every step. The house she'd lived in for 2 decades had become a tactical playground, every corner and doorway a potential advantage. 2 more sicarios burst through the side door, their weapons spraying wildly. Sarah dropped to one knee behind the kitchen island, letting their undisciplined fire pass harmlessly overhead. In the brief pause as they reloaded, she struck. Rolling to the edge of the counter, she fired twice, 2 clean shots that sent both men crumpling to the floor. "Who the hell is she?" one of the survivors shouted from outside. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile as she ejected her empty magazine and slammed a fresh one home. They were beginning to realize this wasn't the simple kidnapping they'd planned for. Through the window, she caught movement, 3 men trying to flank her position from the barn. Sarah reached into her cache of weapons, pulling out a compact PDW she'd kept hidden behind the refrigerator. The familiar weight of the weapon brought back memories of close-quarters operations in compounds, not unlike her ranch. "You're making a mistake," Ramirez called out, his earlier bravado replaced by growing desperation. "Do you know who you're dealing with?" Sarah's response came in the form of precise bursts of fire that forced him and his men further back. She moved to the rear of the house, using the shadows to her advantage. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, creating perfect cover for her movements. One of the cartel members made the mistake of trying to rush her position. Sarah's reaction was instantaneous, a fluid combination of moves that sent his weapon clattering to the floor before she struck, using his own momentum to slam him into the wall. The sickening crunch of his nose breaking was followed by a swift strike to his temple that left him unconscious. Outside, she could hear the remaining men regrouping. Their tactical formation was sloppy, clustered too close together. These weren't trained fighters, they were bullies used to intimidating unarmed civilians. Sarah reached for a flashbang grenade she'd stashed years ago, pulled the pin, and threw it through the broken window. The explosion of light and sound sent the cartel members reeling. Sarah used the confusion to her advantage, moving from cover to cover as she picked them off one by one. Each shot was deliberate, aimed to wound rather than kill. She wanted them to remember this, to carry the story back to their bosses. Ramirez had retreated to the safety of one of the trucks, shouting into a radio for backup. Sarah could make out fragments of his panicked transmission, calling for more men, describing a situation spiraling out of control. She moved outside now, using the gathering darkness to her advantage. The ranch's exterior lights suddenly blazed to life. Eduardo must be returning from his fence check. Sarah cursed under her breath. She'd hoped to have this finished before he got back. The distraction cost her a precious second as one of the sicarios emerged from behind a water tank, his rifle trained on her position. Sarah rolled behind a stack of hay bales just as bullets tore through the space where she'd been standing. In one smooth motion, she drew her backup weapon, a compact .45 strapped to her ankle, and fired through a gap in the bales. The sicario fell, clutching his shoulder. "Sarah!" Eduardo's voice carried across the yard, filled with confusion and fear. She could see his truck approaching in the distance, headlights illuminating the chaos that had erupted at their home. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command that had once directed special operations teams. To her relief, Eduardo's truck skidded to a stop, hanging back at a safe distance. Ramirez seized the moment of distraction to make his move, emerging from behind his truck with an automatic weapon. "You're dead, puta," he snarled, squeezing the trigger. But Sarah was already moving, diving into a roll that carried her behind. An old tractor as bullets kicked up dust around her. She came up firing, her shots precise and measured. The first round struck Ramirez's weapon, sending it spinning from his grip. The second caught him in the thigh, dropping him to one knee. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The lieutenant's face contorted in pain and disbelief as he realized just how badly he'd miscalculated this operation. The remaining cartel members, seeing their leader fallen, began to retreat. They fired wildly as they backed toward their vehicles, more concerned with escape than accuracy. Sarah let them go, keeping her weapon trained on Ramirez as the sound of screeching tires and revving engines filled the air. Sarah advanced on Ramirez, her movements calculated and precise as she kept her weapon trained on him. The cartel lieutenant clutched his wounded leg, his face twisted in a mixture of pain and disbelief as he stared up at the woman he'd so grievously underestimated. Behind them, Eduardo's truck approached slowly, its headlights illuminating the aftermath of the brief but intense firefight. "Who? What are you?" Ramirez gasped, blood seeping between his fingers as he tried to staunch the wound in his thigh. Sarah's expression remained impassive as she kicked his dropped weapon further away, her eyes never leaving his face. "That's not important," she replied, her voice cold and steady. "What matters is the message you're going to deliver." She could hear Eduardo's footsteps approaching, his boots crunching on the gravel, but she kept her focus on the wounded man before her. "Sarah!" Eduardo's voice was filled with confusion and concern. "Mi amor, what's happening here?" She didn't turn to look at him, couldn't afford to take her eyes off Ramirez, but she could imagine the shock on her husband's face as he surveyed the scene. The bullet-riddled walls of their home, the wounded cartel members groaning on the ground, his wife standing like a warrior with a gun trained on their tormentor. "Stay back, Eduardo," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. To her relief, his footsteps stopped. 20 years of marriage, and now in a matter of minutes, everything would change. The life they'd built together, the peaceful existence they'd shared, was about to be transformed by the truth she'd kept hidden for so long. Ramirez's eyes darted between them, his tactical mind working despite the pain. "You're not just some rancher's wife," he spat, realization dawning on his face. "The way you move, the way you shoot. You're military." Sarah allowed herself a small, dangerous smile. "Once upon a time, now I'm just a woman protecting her home." She took a step closer, her aim never wavering. "And you're going to help me send a message to your bosses." Eduardo moved closer, and this time Sarah couldn't stop him. He came to stand beside her, his presence both comforting and concerning. She could feel his eyes on her, full of questions she'd have to answer soon enough. "The cartel doesn't take messages," Ramirez growled, trying to summon back some of his bravado. "They'll come back with more men, better weapons. You can't fight them all." Sarah's laugh was sharp and without humor. "You think this was luck? You think I just happened to take down 10 of your men by chance?" She gestured to the wounded, sicarios scattered across their property. "This was me being gentle, Ramirez. This was me giving you a chance to walk away." She crouched down, bringing herself to eye level with the wounded lieutenant. I spent 15 years as a combat specialist, training others how to kill efficiently and effectively. The medals buried under my floorboards would tell you stories that would turn your blood cold. So when I tell you that I can handle whatever your bosses send, you better believe it. Eduardo inhaled sharply at her words, but remained silent. Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get in your truck and drive back to whoever sent you. You're going to tell them that the Martinez Ranch is off limits. If they want to, I'd test me fine, but they better bring an army next time. Ramirez's face paled, whether from blood loss or fear. It was hard to tell. They'll kill me for failing, he protested weakly. Then you better be very convincing about why they shouldn't. Come back, Sarah replied coldly. Because if they do, what happened here tonight will seem like a warm-up. She stepped back, allowing Ramirez to struggle to his feet. He limped toward his remaining truck, supported by one of his less injured men who had emerged from hiding. As they reached the vehicle, Sarah called out one last time. And Ramirez, next time you think about threatening someone's family, remember the night you found out what a rancher's wife is capable of. The truck's engine roared to life, and within moments, the cartel members had disappeared into the darkness, leaving only dust and spent bullet casings as evidence of their visit. Sarah finally allowed herself to lower her weapon, though her body remained tense, ready for any surprise return. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could feel Eduardo's eyes on her, could sense the weight of 2 decades of secrets hanging between them. Slowly, she turned to face her husband, seeing in his expression a mixture of awe, fear, and confusion that broke her heart. Eduardo, she began, but he held up a hand, stopping her. Inside, he said quietly, we need to talk, and we need to do it now, while we wait to see if they come back. Sarah nodded, knowing this was just the beginning. The night was far from over, and explanations were long overdue. As they walked toward their bullet-riddled home, she kept her weapon ready. The cartel wouldn't return tonight, but they would be back, and next time they'd be better prepared. So would she. Inside their damaged home, Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, securing doors and windows, while Eduardo sat at their scarred kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around an untouched cup of coffee. Bullet holes peppered the walls, and broken glass crunched beneath their feet, stark evidence of the violence that had shattered their peaceful existence. 15 years, you said. Eduardo finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. 15 years as a combat specialist. All this time, I thought you were a secretary in the military. He looked up at her, his dark eyes searching her face as if seeing her for the first time. Sarah finished her security check and sat down across from him, placing her weapon on the table, close enough to grab if needed. I couldn't tell you, she began, then corrected herself. No, that's not true. I chose not to tell you. The life I lived before. I wanted to leave it behind. Eduardo's hand trembled slightly as he pushed his coffee cup aside. Those men tonight. You knew exactly what you were doing. The weapons hidden in our home, the training. None of that was accident or luck. Sarah shook her head, watching as her husband processed the revelation. I was part of an elite unit, she explained, the words feeling strange after so many years of silence. We specialized in close-quarter combat, infiltration, and high-risk operations, the kind of missions that don't make it into official records. And the medals you mentioned? Eduardo's voice cracked slightly. The ones under our floorboards? Sarah rose slowly, moving to the corner of the room. She knelt down, prying up a loose floorboard to reveal a metal box she hadn't opened. In 20 years, the hinges creaked as she lifted the lid, exposing the tangible remnants of her previous life. Silver star, bronze star with valor device, purple heart, she listed quietly, laying each medal on the table. Citations for actions I can't discuss. missions that officially never happened. She paused, touching the last medal gently. This one was for an operation in South America. A cartel, much like the one we're dealing with now, had taken American hostages. Eduardo picked up one of the medals, turning it over in his hands. "All these years," he murmured. "The nightmares, where you always insisted on specific security measures. I thought it was just anxiety from your time in service." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "I thought I could leave it all behind. When I met you, fell in love with this ranch and the life we could have here. I wanted to be just Sarah Martinez, rancher's wife. But tonight proved that some things you can't escape." A sudden noise outside made them both tense. Sarah had her weapon in hand before Eduardo could even turn his head, but it was just the wind rattling a loose piece of siding. Still, she didn't relax her vigilance. "They'll come back," Eduardo stated, not a question but a certainty. Sarah nodded grimly. "Yes, but not tonight. Ramirez will report to his superiors, and they'll need time to plan. When they do return, it won't be a simple kidnapping attempt. They'll come in force. What do we do?" Eduardo asked, and Sarah felt a surge of love for this man, who, despite having his world turned upside down, was already thinking in terms of we rather than you. "First, we get you somewhere safe," she began, but Eduardo cut her off with a sharp gesture. "No, this is my home too, Sarah, our home. I may not be a trained soldier, but I know how to shoot, and I won't leave you to face this alone." Sarah studied her husband's face, seeing the determination there. She thought about arguing, about insisting he leave for his own safety, but she recognized the stubborn set of his jaw. It was the same expression he'd worn when standing up to the cartel's initial threats. "All right," she conceded, "but if you're staying, we do this my way. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to teach you everything I know about defensive operations. We'll need to fortify the ranch, set up fallback positions, establish escape routes." Eduardo nodded, reaching across the table to take her hand. His touch was gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of earlier. "Who else knows," he asked, "about your past?" "There's one person," Sarah admitted, "an old teammate who runs a private security firm now. His name is Marcus Chen, and we're going to need his help. The cartel has resources, manpower, and nothing to lose. We'll need every advantage we can get." Eduardo squeezed her hand. "Then call him, whatever it takes to protect our home." Sarah stood, moving to the window to scan the darkness beyond. The desert night was quiet, but she knew it was just the calm before the storm. Somewhere, out there, the cartel was already planning their revenge, and Sarah knew their response would be brutal. "Get some rest," she told Eduardo. "Tomorrow we start preparing, and Eduardo," she turned to face him, "thank you for understanding." He smiled sadly. 20 years of marriage counts for something, mi amor. Even if I'm just now learning who my wife really is." Sarah watched as he headed to their bedroom, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she'd dragged him into her war. But as she settled in for the first watch of many to come, she knew one thing for certain. She would do whatever it took to protect him and the life they'd built together. The night stretched ahead, full of shadows and possibilities, and Sarah, Martinez, former combat specialist turned rancher's wife, prepared herself for the battles to come. Dawn broke over the Martinez Ranch, painting the bullet-scarred adobe walls in shades of pink and gold. Sarah hadn't slept, maintaining her vigil through the night, while Eduardo dozed fitfully in their bedroom. Now, as the first rays of sunlight crept across the desert, she began implementing her defense strategy. "First thing we need to do is clear the firing lines," Sarah explained to Eduardo as they stood on their front porch, the morning air still crisp. She gestured to the various structures around their property, the barn, storage sheds, and equipment stations. Anyone approaching the house will want to use these for cover. We need to make that as difficult as possible. Eduardo nodded, taking in the landscape with new eyes. The hay bales by the barn, he said. We should move them. They provided too much cover last night. Sarah felt a surge of pride at his observation. Exactly. We'll relocate them behind the house, create a defensive position there. But first, I need to make a call. She pulled out an old flip phone, one she'd kept charged but unused for years, hidden away with her medals. The phone rang 3 times. Before a familiar voice answered, "Ghost Tactical, this is Chen." "Marcus," Sarah said, her voice steady. "It's Quick Draw." The old call sign felt strange on her tongue after so many years. There was a long pause on the other end. "Well, well," Marcus finally replied, his tone a mixture of surprise and concern. 20 years of silence, and now you're using the emergency line. How bad is it?" "Cartel problem," Sarah said simply. "Had to dust off some old skills last night. Could use some equipment and an extra pair of hands." "Cartel?" Marcus's voice sharpened. "Los Salvajes. They've been pushing hard into New Mexico lately." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "You know them." "Been tracking their movements for a private client. They're not your typical outfit. Better trained, better equipped. Word is, they've been recruiting ex-military from south of the border." "That explains a few things," Sarah muttered, thinking of the precision with which they'd approached her ranch. "How fast can you get here?" "I can be there by nightfall," Marcus replied. "Still at that ranch you bought when you got out?" "Same place. Bring everything you can. They'll be back, and next time it won't be a simple grab team." "Already packing," Marcus assured her. "And Sarah, it's good to hear your voice again." After ending the call, Sarah turned to find Eduardo watching her intently. "Marcus Chen," she explained, "former teammate, now runs a private security company. He's bringing supplies and support." Eduardo's expression was thoughtful. "Quick draw?" he asked, referring to her call sign. Sarah smiled slightly, remembering. "I had a reputation for being fast on the draw, especially in close quarters. The name stuck." They spent the morning fortifying their position, moving obstacles, and creating clear fields of fire. Sarah showed Eduardo how to set up improvised early warning systems, tripwires connected to small bells, pressure plates made from scrap metal and springs. "The key is layers," she explained as they worked. "We want to know they're coming long before they reach the house. Each layer of defense needs to slow them down, make them hesitate, give us time to react." Eduardo proved to be a quick study, his years of ranch work translating well to the physical demands of their preparations. By midday, they had transformed their home into a defensive position that would have made Sarah's old combat instructors proud. As they broke for water, Eduardo asked the question that had been hanging between them. "How many do you think they'll send next time?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "After last night? At least 20, probably more. They'll come. Heavy, better weapons, body armor, maybe even vehicles with mounted guns. They can't afford to underestimate us again." "Us," Eduardo repeated, emphasizing the word. "You know, when I married you, I never imagined we'd be preparing for a siege against a cartel." Sarah touched his arm gently. "I never wanted this life to find you. If you want to leave, go somewhere safe." Eduardo cut her off with a shake of his head. "This ranch is ours, our home, our life. If they want it, they'll have to fight, both of us for it." The sound of an approaching vehicle caught their attention. Sarah had her weapon up before she consciously registered the movement, but she relaxed slightly as a familiar black SUV appeared on the horizon. "Marcus," she said, lowering her gun but not holstering it. He made good time. The SUV pulled up to the house, and a tall Asian man in tactical gear stepped out, his movements fluid and precise. He surveyed the ranch with professional interest before his eyes landed on Sarah. "Looking good for someone who's been playing rancher for 20 years, he called out, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Though I hear you haven't lost your touch." Sarah approached her old teammate, noting the new scars on his face and the grey at his temples. "Good to see you, Marcus. Thanks for coming." Marcus's expression turned serious as he opened the SUV's rear doors, revealing an arsenal of weapons and equipment. "Let's get to work. We've got a lot to do before they come. I'm back, and trust me, they're coming." Sarah nodded grimly, knowing the real fight was just beginning. The cartel was about to learn a harsh lesson about underestimating their opponents, and she intended to make it one they'd never forget. Marcus worked with military efficiency as he unloaded the SUV, laying out an impressive array of tactical gear on their kitchen table. Body armor, communications equipment, thermal optics, and enough ammunition to fight a small war spread across the wooden surface like a deadly feast. "Got some of your old favorites," he said, pulling out a customized carbine that made Sarah's eyes light up with recognition. "Still kept in stock, just in case you ever came calling." Sarah picked up the weapon, muscle memory taking over as she checked its mechanics. "You maintained it all these years?" "Someone had to," Marcus replied, his tone casual but meaningful. "Not all of us tried to completely disappear." He paused, glancing at Eduardo, who was examining a set of body armor. "No offense to your life choices." Eduardo looked between them, sensing the weight of history. "You two served together long." 7 years, Marcus answered before Sarah could. "Your wife was the best CQB instructor in the unit. Taught me everything I know about room clearing and close quarters combat. Saved my life more times than I care to count." Sarah focused on assembling her gear, avoiding the memories Marcus's words stirred up. That was a lifetime ago. Right now, we need to focus on the present. What intel do you have on Los Salvajes? Marcus's expression turned serious as he pulled out a laptop. They've been expanding aggressively into New Mexico over the past year. Their leader, Victor Delgado, is ex-military, Mexican Special Forces. He's turned them into something more professional than your typical cartel outfit. That explains their tactics last night, Sarah mused, remembering the coordinated approach they'd used. They're not just thugs with guns. No, they're not, Marcus agreed. And after last night, they'll come at you with everything they've got. Delgado doesn't tolerate failure or humiliation. The fact that a rancher's wife took down his men. He shook his head. He'll make this personal. Eduardo stepped forward, his face determined. Then we make them regret it. What's our strategy? Sarah felt a surge of pride at her husband's resolve. We've got the advantage of terrain and preparation. We know every inch of this ranch, every approach angle, every bit of cover. We use that. Marcus nodded, pulling up satellite imagery of the ranch and surrounding area on his laptop. "I've got some friends running surveillance. They'll give us early warning when Delgado's men start moving. Based on their usual patterns, we've got maybe 48 hours before they hit you." "Good," Sarah said, studying the map. "That gives us time to set up proper defensive positions. Marcus, you brought the surveillance gear I asked for." He patted a large case. "Full package. Motion sensors, night vision, thermal. We'll see them coming long before they get close." The three of them spent the next few hours setting up a defensive perimeter around the ranch. Sarah showed Eduardo how to use the communication equipment while Marcus planted motion sensors at strategic points along likely approach routes. "Remember," Sarah instructed as they worked, "if shooting starts, you stay in your assigned position. No heroics, no improvising. We stick to the plan." Eduardo nodded, but his expression was troubled. "Sarah, if these men are as professional as Marcus says, what are our real chances?" Sarah shared a look with Marcus before answering. Better than you might think. Yes, they're trained, but they're also overconfident. They're used to intimidating civilians, not fighting experienced operators. Plus, Marcus added, checking the sight alignment on a rifle. They don't know about me yet. They'll be expecting the same situation they faced last night. One skilled operator and a civilian. We can use that surprise to our advantage. As the sun began to set, they gathered back in the kitchen to review their preparations. The ranch had been transformed into a hardened defensive position with multiple fallback points and interlocking fields of fire. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, pulling out a satellite phone. "I've got a QRF on standby. Former teammates who work for my company now. If things go sideways, they can be here in 30 minutes by helicopter." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's not cheap. What's the catch?" Marcus smiled grimly. "Let's just say I've been looking for an excuse to bloody Delgado's nose. Your situation provides a perfect opportunity." "You're using us as bait," Eduardo said, his voice neutral. "More like mutual benefit," Marcus corrected. "You get backup if you need it, and I get a shot at disrupting Delgado's operation. Everyone wins." Sarah considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right, but we try to handle this ourselves first. I don't want to escalate things more than necessary." As night fell over the ranch, they took up their initial positions. Sarah could feel the familiar pre-combat tension building in her muscles, a sensation she hadn't experienced in 20 years. Beside her, Eduardo checked his weapon for the 10th time, his movements becoming more confident with each repetition. "Get some rest," she told him softly. "Tomorrow we start rehearsing scenarios. When they come, we need to be ready." Eduardo reached over and squeezed her hand. "We will be," he assured her, "together." Sarah squeezed back, praying she hadn't just signed her husband's death warrant by involving him in her world. But as she watched him move with growing confidence among their defenses, she realized he was stronger than she'd given him credit for. They would face whatever came together, and God help anyone who tried to take their home from them. Sarah awoke before dawn, her internal clock still precise after all these years. The ranch was quiet, except for the soft whisper of wind through the desert scrub. She found Marcus already up, monitoring the surveillance equipment they'd set up. "The previous day, movement on the southern access road," he reported without looking up from his screen. "Looks like they're doing reconnaissance. 2 vehicles, probably 4 men total." Sarah checked her weapon out of habit, though she knew it was ready. Getting bold, running recon in daylight. They must be planning something soon. "My sources say Delgado himself is taking an interest in this operation," Marcus replied, adjusting one of the camera feeds. "After last night's failure, he's making it personal." Eduardo emerged from the bedroom, already dressed and geared up in the body armor they'd fitted him with yesterday. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "What's the word?" "Cartel scouts on the South Road," Sarah informed him. "Time to put our training to the test. You remember the response plan we discussed?" Eduardo nodded, moving to the kitchen to start coffee. "If they breach the outer perimeter, we fall back to defensive position Alpha. If they flank us there, we move to Bravo. No firing unless fired upon, or they cross the warning line." Sarah felt a surge of pride at his precise recall. They'd spent hours drilling these procedures yesterday, and Eduardo had thrown himself into the training with unexpected aptitude. The ranch hand's practical experience with firearms and knowledge of the terrain had proven invaluable. "They're turning onto the access road," Marcus announced, his voice tight. "Looks like they're going to probe our defenses." Sarah moved to the window, staying in the shadows as she observed the approaching vehicles through her binoculars. 2 black SUVs moving slowly along the dirt road that led to their ranch. The morning sun glinted off their windshields, making it difficult to get a clear view of the occupants. Eduardo, take position in the barn, she ordered calmly. Marcus, get on the thermal scope. I want to know exactly how many we're dealing with. Both men moved without question, the previous day's drills paying off in smooth efficiency. Sarah watched as the vehicles drew closer, noting their professional spacing and approach angle. These weren't the overconfident thugs from last night. These were trained operators conducting a proper reconnaissance. I count 6 heat signatures, Marcus reported through their radio earpieces. Driver and passenger in each vehicle, plus 2 in the rear of the lead SUV. They're all armed. Sarah keyed her radio. Eduardo, status? In position, her husband replied, his voice remarkably steady. I have clear sight lines to both vehicles. The SUVs stopped about 200 yards from the ranch house, just at the edge of the property line they'd marked with warning signs. A man emerged from the passenger side of the lead vehicle, holding up his hands in an exaggerated gesture of peace. "Senora Martinez!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "We come only to talk." Sarah remained silent, watching through her scope as the man took a few steps forward. He was well dressed in an expensive suit, unusual attire for a morning reconnaissance. Behind him, she could see the other men remaining in their vehicles, hands clearly on weapons. "My name is Carlos Vega," the man continued. "I represent Mr. Delgado. He would like to discuss last night's misunderstanding." Marcus's voice crackled in her earpiece. "Carlos Vega, Delgado's chief negotiator. He only shows up when they're planning something big." Sarah weighed her options. Engaging in dialogue would give away her position, but it might also provide valuable intelligence about their intentions. "That's close enough, Mr. Vega," she called out, keeping her position concealed. "Say what you came to say." Vega smiled, spreading his hands wider. "Mr. Delgado admires strength, Senora. What happened last night? It shows you are not someone to be underestimated. He would like to make you an offer." "Not interested," Sarah replied flatly. "Tell your boss this ranch is off limits." "Ah, but you haven't heard the offer," Vega pressed. "Mr. Delgado is willing to pay you handsomely for your cooperation. Your skills could be very valuable to our organization." Sarah's finger tightened slightly on her trigger. "Last warning, Mr. Vega. Leave my property now." The negotiator's friendly demeanor slipped slightly. "Consider carefully, Senora. Mr. Delgado's patience has limits. What happened last night was unfortunate, but it can be forgiven. If you refuse his generous offer, however." He left the threat hanging. "I see 6 armed men making threats on my property," Sarah responded coldly. "You have 30 seconds to leave before I consider this a hostile action." Vega stared in her general direction for a long moment before nodding slowly. "As you wish, Senora. Remember that we tried to be reasonable." He turned and walked back to his vehicle with measured steps. The SUVs reversed carefully before turning around, maintaining their professional discipline even in retreat. Sarah watched until they disappeared from view before keying her radio. "Everyone hold positions until Marcus confirms they're clear of the outer perimeter. That was just the opening move. The real attack is coming soon." She knew Vega's visit was meant to rattle them, to make them second-guess their resolve. Instead, it had only strengthened her determination. The cartel was about to learn that some people couldn't be bought or intimidated. The storm was coming, and Sarah Martinez was ready to weather it. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Martinez Ranch as Sarah, Marcus, and Eduardo fine-tuned their defensive preparations. The morning's visit from Vega had added urgency to their work. They all knew the cartel's next move would be decisive and violent. "Thermal sensors are picking up wildlife movement to the north," Marcus reported from his monitoring station. "But nothing that looks like human activity. They're being cautious after last night." Sarah nodded. checking the magazine in her rifle for the 100th time. They'll wait for dark. Vega's visit was meant to throw us off balance, make us tired and jumpy by the time they actually strike. Eduardo emerged from the barn, wiping sweat from his forehead. I finished setting up the last of the defensive positions like you showed me. Those old hay bales make surprisingly good cover when properly positioned. Good work, Sarah replied, studying her husband with a mixture of pride and concern. In less than 24 hours, he'd transformed from a peaceful rancher into a surprisingly capable defensive fighter. The thought brought both comfort and guilt. Marcus's voice cut through her reflections. Sarah, you need to see this. His tone carried an edge that had both Sarah and Eduardo hurrying to his position. At the monitoring station, on one of the screens, a thermal image showed a clear heat signature moving through the desert brush about a mile out. Single individual, Marcus explained, moving with tactical precision. Could be another scout, but something feels off. Sarah studied the figure's movement pattern, recognition dawning in her eyes. That's not a scout, she said grimly. That's Santiago Rivera. Marcus's head snapped up. The ghost? You're sure? Who's Santiago Rivera? Eduardo asked, looking between them. Sarah's expression hardened. Former Mexican special forces like Delgado. We crossed paths during an operation in Sonora years ago. He's one of the best infiltration specialists I've ever seen. If they brought in the ghost, this is bigger than we thought, Marcus muttered, adjusting the thermal scope to track Rivera's movement. He doesn't come cheap, and he only takes jobs that interest him, personally. Sarah watched the figure's methodical progress through their outer perimeter. He's mapping our defenses, looking for weak points. That means they're planning to hit us tonight. Can we take him out from here? Eduardo asked, surprising both. Sarah and Marcus, with his tactical thinking. Sarah shook her head. He's too good for that. If we fire now, we give away our positions and lose the element of surprise. Better to let him think he's undetected. Besides, Marcus added, where Rivera goes, a strike team usually follows. He's probably got backup waiting just out of our sensor range. Sarah made a quick decision. Eduardo, get on the north observation post. Watch for any additional movement, but do not engage. Marcus, keep tracking Rivera. I'm going to adjust our defensive positions based on his likely approach. Vector. As they moved to their assigned tasks, Sarah felt the familiar clarity of combat focus settling over her. Rivera's presence changed everything. He wasn't just a cartel enforcer. He was a professional who'd recognize and counter standard defensive tactics. Sarah, Marcus called out softly as she passed him. Remember Sonora, what he did to those federales? I remember, she replied grimly. The memory of finding those mutilated bodies still haunted her. He won't get that chance here. For the next hour, they watched as Rivera methodically probed their defenses. He discovered some of their warning sensors, exactly as Sarah had planned, but missed the secondary layer of triggers she'd hidden more carefully. He's pulling back, Marcus announced finally, heading due west, probably to report our positions. Sarah checked her watch. Sunset was less than 2 hours away. They'll come in from multiple directions, she said, gathering Eduardo and Marcus for a final briefing. Rivera will lead a team from the north, using the approach route he just scouted. They'll expect us to focus our defense there. While another team hits us from the south, Marcus finished, following her thinking. Classic pincer movement. Exactly. Eduardo, you'll stay in the barn. It's the most defensible position, and you have clear lines of fire to both likely approach routes. Marcus, take the house's east corner. I'll cover the west. We let them think their initial breach is succeeding, then collapse the trap once they're committed. Eduardo checked his weapon with practiced movements that would have been unthinkable just days ago. And if they get past our outer defenses? Fall back to your secondary position and maintain fire discipline, Sarah instructed. Remember, Rivera will be looking for any sign of our numbers and positions. Every shot has to count. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in deep reds and purples. Sarah felt time compressed, each minute bringing them closer to the inevitable confrontation. She looked at Eduardo, seeing the same determination in his eyes that she'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. "No matter what happens," she told him softly, "know that I love you, and I'm sorry I brought this to our door." Eduardo reached out and squeezed her hand. "You didn't bring this, mi amor. The cartel did, and we'll face it together." Marcus's voice crackled over their radio. "Movement on the southern perimeter. Multiple heat signatures spreading out in tactical formation." Sarah squared her shoulders, weapon ready. "Take your positions. Remember your training. And Eduardo—" She paused, meeting his eyes one last time. "Stay alive." As darkness settled over the Martinez Ranch, 3 defenders prepared to face an army. The night wind carried the promise of violence, and Sarah Martinez, once again the warrior she'd tried to leave behind, embraced it like an old friend. The real battle was about to begin. Night had fully descended on the Martinez Ranch when the first shot shattered the desert. Silence. Sarah tracked the muzzle flash from her position, a test shot from Rivera's team, probing for a response. She remained motionless, weapon trained on the darkness. "Multiple heat signatures approaching from the south," Marcus whispered through the radio. "I count 12, moving in standard assault formation. They're being careful, using the terrain for cover." Sarah keyed her radio twice to acknowledge, maintaining noise discipline. Through her night vision optics, she could see shadows moving in the darkness, professional operators advancing with practiced precision. Rivera's influence was evident in their approach. The first explosion caught everyone by surprise. One of Sarah's carefully hidden charges detonated on the southern perimeter, sending 2 cartel gunmen flying. Immediately, the night erupted in chaos as both assault teams opened fire, their automatic weapons lighting up the darkness. "Hold position," Sarah commanded as bullets whizzed overhead. "Let them commit to the attack." Eduardo's voice came through the radio, remarkably steady. 4 tangos, moving toward the barn, using the old tractor for cover. Sarah watched as Rivera's team advanced from the north, using the confusion of the southern assault as cover. They moved like ghosts, barely visible even with night vision. But Sarah had been expecting this. It was exactly what she would have done. "Marcus, hit the floods on my mark," she ordered, waiting as Rivera's team crept closer. They were approaching her first trap, right where she wanted them. "Now!" Powerful floodlights blazed to life, temporarily blinding anyone using night vision. Sarah was already moving, her first shots taking down 2 of Rivera's men before they could adjust. The northern team scattered seeking cover, but they'd been caught in the open. The southern team used this distraction to press their attack, advancing aggressively toward the house. Sarah heard Eduardo's rifle crack 3 times in rapid succession, followed by shouts of pain from the attackers. "3 down," Eduardo reported. "But they're still coming." Marcus's position erupted in gunfire as he engaged targets trying to flank the house. "Sarah, Rivera's moving toward your position." She was already rolling to a new firing point, years of training taking over. A bullet sparked off the wall where her head had been moments before. Rivera hadn't lost his touch. Sarah counted. Her heartbeats, waiting for the perfect moment, then popped up to return fire. Rivera was good, already gone from his previous position, but Sarah caught movement to her left. 2 quick shots dropped another cartel gunman who'd been trying to work his way around her flank. "South team pulling back," Marcus reported, regrouping behind the equipment shed. "Wait, multiple vehicles approaching fast from both directions." Sarah cursed under her breath. "They're bringing in their second wave." Eduardo, fall back to position Bravo. Marcus, hit the secondary charges. More explosions rocked the night as the hidden charges detonated, taking out one of the approaching vehicles, but more kept coming. She counted at least 4 SUVs and what looked like a tactical truck. "Technical on the South Road," Marcus shouted. "Mounted, 50 cal." The heavy machine gun opened up, its massive rounds chewing through walls and cover like paper. Sarah rolled behind a concrete water trough as bullets kicked up dust around her. "Eduardo, status!" she called out, heart pounding. "I'm okay," he replied, "in the fallback position. I can see the technical from here." Sarah made a quick decision. "Marcus, covering fire on the north team. Eduardo, on my mark, target the technical's gunner. I'll take the driver." She waited until the heavy gun paused to reload, then shouted, "Mark." 2 rifles cracked in perfect synchronization. The technical's gunner pitched backward as Eduardo's shot found its mark, while Sarah's round went through the windshield, eliminating the driver. The vehicle swerved, crashing into a drainage ditch, but Rivera was using this distraction to close in. Sarah caught movement in her peripheral vision and spun, barely getting her rifle up in time to block his knife strike. The weapon went flying. As they grappled, Rivera's superior size against Sarah's speed and technique. "I've waited years for this rematch," Rivera growled in Spanish, driving a knee toward her midsection. Sarah rolled with the blow, coming up with her backup pistol, but Rivera was already moving. His boot caught her wrist, sending the gun spinning away. They squared off in the darkness, 2 professionals who'd spent decades perfecting the art of killing. "You're good," Sarah admitted, circling warily. "But you made one mistake." Rivera's eyes narrowed. "Oh? You forgot I never fight alone." Marcus's rifle barked once, and Rivera staggered as the round took him in the shoulder. Sarah was moving instantly, years of CQB training taking over as she closed the distance. Her elbow caught him in the temple, and the legendary ghost crumpled to the ground. But there was no time to celebrate. More vehicles were arriving, and the night was far from over. Sarah retrieved her weapons, keying her radio. "Rivera's down. Everyone check in." "Still here," Eduardo replied, "running low on ammo." "Same," Marcus added. "Sarah, we've got at least 20 more incoming. Might be time to call in that QRF." Sarah looked at Rivera's unconscious form, then at the approaching cartel reinforcements. They'd bloodied the cartel's nose, but now it was time to end this. "Make the call," she ordered, "and get ready for round 2. The night was about to get a lot more interesting. The sound of gunfire intensified as Marcus called in the QRF. Sarah dragged Rivera's unconscious form behind cover, zip-tying his hands and feet. He was too valuable to leave exposed. A high-ranking cartel operator who could provide crucial intelligence. "QRF is 20 minutes out," Marcus reported, his voice nearly drowned out by the increasingly heavy fire. "But we've got problems. They're setting up mortars on the ridge." As if to confirm his warning, the first mortar round whistled through the night air, exploding near the barn in a shower of dirt and shrapnel. Eduardo's position. "Eduardo!" Sarah shouted into her radio, her heart stopping for a moment. "I'm okay," his voice crackled back, "but they've got me pinned down, can't reach the ammunition cache." Sarah did a quick mental calculation. They had to hold out for 20 minutes, but the mortar fire would tear their positions apart long before then. She needed to buy time. "Marcus, can you get a shot at those mortar teams?" "Negative. They're just out of range for accurate fire in these conditions." Another mortar round landed closer to the house, the concussion rattling windows and sending debris flying. Sarah could hear vehicles moving closer, the cartel forces growing bolder with their superior firepower. "New plan," she announced. "Eduardo, stay in cover. Marcus, get to the barn's east side. I'm going to create a distraction." Before either man could protest, Sarah was moving. She sprinted through the darkness, using the chaos of the mortar fire as cover. The cartel forces were focusing their attention on the defended positions, not expecting anyone to move into the open. Sarah reached the old tractor they used for spare parts, quickly placing shaped charges she'd prepared earlier. Then she moved to her real target, the propane tanks behind the equipment shed. "Both of you, focus fire on the southern approach," she ordered through her radio. "Make them think we're falling back in that direction." Marcus and Eduardo opened up with coordinated rifle fire, drawing the cartel's attention. Sarah used the distraction to rig the propane tanks, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the bullets flying overhead. "Impact in 10 seconds, Ida," she called out. "Cover your eyes." The explosion, when it came, was massive. The shaped charges on the tractor detonated first, sending deadly fragments toward the cartel's lines. Split seconds later, the propane tanks went up in a massive fireball, illuminating the entire battlefield. Through her night vision, Sarah could see cartel gunmen scrambling for cover, their neat formations broken by the unexpected blast. More importantly, the mortar teams on the ridge had stopped firing, momentarily stunned by the explosion. "Moving to Phase 2, Sarah announced, already sprinting toward her next position. "Marcus, hit their vehicles." Marcus's rifle began, picking off drivers and gunners, disabling the cartel's mobile elements one by one. Eduardo added his fire to the mix, the two men working in concert to keep the attackers off balance. Sarah reached the water tower, quickly scaling the maintenance ladder. From this elevated position, she had clear lines of sight to the entire battlefield. The cartel forces had split into 3 groups, one still trying to advance from the south, one regrouping near their disabled vehicles, and one attempting to reach the fallen Rivera. 10 minutes to QRF, Marcus updated. Sarah began engaging targets methodically, using single, precise shots to maximize her remaining ammunition. Each crack of her rifle dropped another cartel gunman, further demoralizing their attackers. But the cartel forces were professionals, and they quickly adapted. Return fire began concentrating on her position, forcing her to stay low behind the water tower's protective wall. "Running low on ammo," Eduardo reported tensely. "Down to my last magazine." "Same here," Marcus added. "We need to consolidate our position, or we'll be overrun before the QRF arrives." Sarah watched as more cartel vehicles arrived, disgorging fresh gunmen. They were preparing for a final push, trying to overwhelm the defenders before reinforcements could arrive. "Fall back to position Delta," she ordered. "We make our stand there." As Eduardo and Marcus began their coordinated withdrawal, Sarah provided covering fire from her elevated position. The cartel forces pressed forward, but every time they tried to rush a position, precision fire from the water tower forced them back. 5 minutes to QRF, Marcus called out. Sarah was down to her last few rounds when she heard it, the distant thump of helicopter rotors. The cartel forces heard it too, their attack faltering as they realized what was coming. "Sarah, get down from there now!" Eduardo's voice carried real fear. "They're bringing up RPGs!" She caught the flash of the rocket's launch and was already moving. The RPG struck the water tower just as she leaped, the explosion sending her tumbling through the air. Sarah hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact as years of training took over. The water tower collapsed behind her with a thunderous crash, but she was already running, ignoring the pain that shot through her shoulder. She could see the cartel forces beginning to fall back, not wanting to face fresh opponents from the air. "QRF 1 minute out," Marcus reported. "Hang on!" Sarah reached the fallback position just as the first helicopter appeared over the ridge, its spotlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. More helicopters followed, their appearance sending the remaining cartel forces into full retreat. But Sarah knew this wasn't over. They'd survived the night, but they'd also just escalated a war with one of the most dangerous cartels in Mexico. As the QRF helicopters touched down, disgorging teams of heavily armed operators, she caught Eduardo's eye. He nodded grimly. understanding, without words. The real fight was just beginning. Dawn broke over the Martinez Ranch, revealing the full extent of the night's battle. The property was littered with bullet casings, spent shell casings, and the smoldering remains of vehicles. QRF teams moved methodically through the battlefield, securing the area and gathering intelligence from fallen cartel members. Sarah stood, with Eduardo and Marcus near their bullet-riddled house, watching as medics treated Rivera's wounds before loading him onto a helicopter. The legendary Ghost had finally been captured, and Sarah knew his arrest would send shockwaves through the cartel's hierarchy. "Latest report from our surveillance teams," Marcus announced, checking his tablet. "Cartel forces have pulled back across the border. They lost at least 15 men, with another dozen wounded. Not counting Rivera, we captured 3 mid-level commanders." Sarah nodded, wincing slightly as a medic examined her injured shoulder. "Any word on Delgado's reaction?" "Nothing concrete yet, but my sources say he's called an emergency meeting of his top lieutenants. Taking Rivera alive, that's going to hurt them more than any number of casualties." Eduardo, who had been quietly observing the cleanup operation, finally spoke. "So what happens now? They won't just let this go." "No, they won't," Sarah agreed, her voice grim. "But we've bought ourselves some time. Rivera's capture will force them to reorganize, rebuild their command structure." A tall, heavily armed operator approached their group. Sarah recognized him as Jackson, one of Marcus's top team leaders. "Ma'am, we've finished sweeping the perimeter. Found some interesting intel on one of their commanders. Looks like they had detailed plans for future operations in the area." Sarah took the offered documents, studying them carefully. They were planning to use our ranch as a staging area for a larger push into New Mexico. That's why they wanted us out so badly. "Makes sense," Marcus commented. "Your location is perfect for moving product across the border. Remote, good road access, plenty of storage space." Eduardo's face hardened. "Our home. They wanted to turn our home into a drug warehouse." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand, noting the fresh calluses from handling weapons. In just a few days, her peaceful rancher husband had been forced to become a warrior, and he'd risen to the challenge admirably. "Commander," a radio operator called out to Marcus, "we're picking up increased chatter from across the border. Looks like Delgado's mobilizing additional forces." Marcus cursed softly. "He's not going to take this lying down. Sarah, you and Eduardo need to consider your options. My team can have you at a secure location within the hour." But Sarah was already shaking her head. "No, we're not running." She looked at Eduardo, seeing the same determination in his eyes. "This is our home. We'll fortify it, strengthen our defenses, and next time they come, we'll be even better prepared." "Besides," Eduardo added with a grim smile, "they've already seen what my wife can do. Let them come." Jackson cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you're staying, my team would be honored to help set up a proper defensive perimeter. We can have hardened positions installed within 48 hours." Sarah considered the offer. Having professional operators help prepare their defenses would significantly improve their chances. "Marcus?" He nodded. "I'll make it happen. We'll set up a rotating QRF presence too. Keep a team within response range at all times." "And Rivera?" Eduardo asked. "He'll be transported to a secure facility," Marcus replied. "Between the intelligence we gathered and his capture, we've got enough to get federal authorities involved. The cartel's going to have bigger problems than your ranch very soon." Sarah watched as more helicopters arrived, bringing additional equipment and personnel. The quiet ranch she'd called home for 20 years was transforming into a fortress, but she felt a strange peace about it. The facade of normal life had been shattered, but in its place, something stronger was emerging. "We should check the ammunition stores," she told Eduardo. "If we're going to train regularly, we'll need more supplies." He nodded, falling naturally into tactical discussion. The barn's east wall needs reinforcement too, and we should consider setting up proper sniper positions on the ridge." Marcus watched their exchange with a mix of pride and amusement. "Never thought I'd see the day. Quick-draw playing rancher and her husband talking about sniper positions." Sarah smiled, but her eyes remained serious. "Life has a way of coming full circle. I thought I could leave that world behind, but maybe this is where I was always meant to be, protecting our home, our life, with all the skills I tried to forget." The sun climbed higher, drying the dew on spent bullet casings and illuminating the aftermath of battle. Sarah Martinez stood with her husband, watching as their ranch was transformed into a stronghold. The cartel had wanted a war, and they'd gotten one. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd underestimated a rancher's wife, who happened to be the deadliest gunslinger they'd ever faced. And next time, she wouldn't be holding back. 3 days after the battle, the Martinez Ranch had been transformed. Military-grade barriers now reinforced key positions, and concealed bunkers dotted the property. Sarah stood on their newly fortified porch, watching as Marcus's team installed the last of the surveillance equipment. "Motion sensors are online," Marcus reported, joining her with a tablet displaying multiple camera feeds. "We've got coverage out to 2 miles in every direction. Nothing's getting close without us knowing about it." Sarah nodded, checking her watch. Eduardo was due back any minute from his supply run into town. They'd sent him with an armed escort, taking no chances. With potential cartel retaliation, "Any word from your contacts about Delgado's next move?" she asked, scanning the horizon out of habit. Marcus swiped through several intelligence reports on his tablet. "He's pulled back most of his forces from the border, but our surveillance shows they're staging equipment at several locations in Mexico. Looks like they're preparing for something big." "How big?" "Remember Juarez in 15? Marcus asked grimly. Sarah's expression hardened. The cartel war in Juarez had left dozens dead and reshaped the entire border region. He's really willing to escalate this that far? Rivera's capture hurt them more than we thought. The intelligence we got from him has already led to several high-profile arrests. Delgado's losing control of his operation. He needs a win, something dramatic to restore his authority. The sound of approaching vehicles caught their attention. Sarah relaxed slightly as she recognized Eduardo's truck, flanked by 2 tactical vehicles from Marcus's security team. "Supply run was successful," Eduardo reported as he climbed out of his truck. "And I picked up some interesting gossip in town. Cartel's been asking questions, trying to figure out exactly who they're dealing with." Sarah helped him unload boxes of ammunition and supplies. "What kind of questions?" "About you, specifically. Seems Rivera's capture has them spooked. They're calling you La Fantasma, the ghost." Marcus chuckled. Ironic, considering Rivera's nickname. "They're also offering rewards," Eduardo continued, his voice tightening. "For information about our defenses, our routines. Some of our neighbors have been approached." Sarah shared a concerned look with Marcus. "We need to expand our surveillance. Monitor everyone who comes within 5 miles of the ranch." "Already on it," Marcus assured her. "I've got teams setting up additional observation posts. No one gets near you without us knowing." They moved inside to their makeshift command center, where multiple screens displayed camera feeds and tactical data. The ranch house's interior had been reinforced, with bulletproof glass installed in all windows and steel plating behind the walls. "Latest intel from Rivera's interrogation," Marcus said, pulling up a secure file. "Delgado's operation is larger than we thought. He's got corrupt officials on both sides of the border, military-grade weapons, even his own intelligence network. Which means he knows exactly what we're doing here," Sarah concluded. "The defensive preparations, the QRF teams, all of it." Eduardo studied the tactical display, So we change the game, make him react to us, instead of the other way around. Both Sarah and Marcus turned to look at him with surprise. Eduardo shrugged. I've been paying attention during training. Best defense is a good offense, right? Sarah felt a surge of pride in her husband's growing tactical awareness. He's right. We need to take the initiative. Marcus, what assets do we have available? Marcus pulled up another screen. 3 full tactical teams on rotating shifts, drone coverage, satellite surveillance. Plus Rivera's intel has given us locations of several cartel weapons caches and safe houses on this side of the border. Federal authorities? Moving slowly, building cases. But they've given us unofficial clearance to act in self-defense. With broad interpretation of what that means, Sarah began formulating a plan. If Delgado wants to make this personal, we'll oblige him, but we'll do it on our terms. Start with his support network, weapons, money, corrupt officials. Squeeze him until he has no choice but to come at us directly. That's dangerous, Marcus warned. He'll throw everything he has at us. Good, Eduardo said firmly. Better here where we're prepared than letting him pick the time and place. Sarah studied the map, already identifying potential targets. We'll need more equipment. Heavy. Weapons, anti-vehicle capabilities, proper air support. I can have it here within 48 hours, Marcus assured her. But Sarah, are you sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back. Sarah looked at Eduardo, seeing the same determination in his eyes that she felt. They came to our home, threatened our family, tried to take everything we've built. I'm done playing defense. Eduardo stepped closer, placing his hand on her shoulder. Whatever you need, mi amor. We face this together. Marcus nodded, already making calls. I'll alert the teams. We can start reconnaissance on the first targets. Tonight. Sarah turned back to the tactical display, her mind shifting into the familiar patterns of operational planning. The cartel had wanted a war, but they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed she was just another target, someone to be intimidated or eliminated. Instead, they'd awakened something they couldn't control. A warrior who'd spent 20 years trying to forget her past, now forced to embrace it fully. And this time, she wasn't fighting alone. The next phase of the war was about to begin, and Sarah Martinez intended to remind everyone why she'd once been the most feared operative in 3 countries. Delgado was about to learn that some ghosts didn't just haunt you, they hunted you. Night operations began immediately. Sarah watched from the command center as live feeds showed Marcus's teams hitting 3 cartel weapons caches simultaneously. The raids were precise, professional. No casualties, just devastating strikes against Delgado's infrastructure. First target secured, a team leader reported through encrypted comms. Weapons cache located and destroyed. Local law enforcement has been notified for cleanup. Sarah marked the location on their digital map, watching as similar reports came in from the other teams. Eduardo stood beside her, learning to read the tactical displays with growing proficiency. Second and third targets confirmed clear, Marcus announced, coordinating from his position in the field, moving to Phase 2. Phase 2 involved targeting the cartel's financial network. Sarah had spent hours studying Rivera's intelligence, identifying key money laundering operations disguised as legitimate businesses. Now, that information was being put to use. Package delivered to federal authorities, another operator reported. Evidence of cartel financial operations at 3 banks, plus names of compromised officials. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Delgado's going to wake up to quite a mess tomorrow morning. Multiple vehicles moving fast from the south. Eduardo noted, pointing to one of the surveillance feeds. Looks like they're responding to the raids. Let them come, Sarah replied calmly. They're scattered, disorganized. Every asset they move is another one we can track. The night continued. With methodical precision, Marcus's team struck like ghosts, dismantling Delgado's operation piece by piece. Sarah coordinated from the ranch, directing forces based on real-time intelligence and her intimate knowledge of cartel tactics. "Incoming transmission," Eduardo announced, indicating a secured line. "It's from our contact in federal law enforcement." Sarah activated the encrypted channel. "This is Martinez." "We've got movement at the border," the federal agent reported. "Large convoy heading north, heavily armed. Looks like Delgado himself is with them." Sarah shared a knowing look with Eduardo. He took the bait. "How many vehicles?" "At least 15, including technical with mounted weapons. They crossed at an unofficial point 20 minutes ago. Local authorities have been advised to stay clear." "Understood. Keep me updated on their movement." Sarah switched channels. "Marcus, convoy approaching from the south. Delgado's making his play." "Copy that," Marcus replied. "Teams are already moving to predetermined positions. QRF standing by." Sarah studied the tactical display, watching red dots representing cartel vehicles move steadily northward. Everything was proceeding according to plan, her plan. "They'll be here within 2 hours, she calculated. "Eduardo, get on the long-range thermal imaging. I want to know their exact composition when they get within range." Eduardo moved to the specialized equipment with practiced ease. In just a few days, he'd learned to operate complex military hardware as if he'd been doing it for years. "Sarah," he called out after a moment, "there's something else. Look at this heat signature." She joined him at the thermal display, focusing on the image he indicated. Among the convoy's heat signatures was one larger than the others, much larger. "Is that what I think it is?" Eduardo asked tensely. Sarah zoomed in, her expression hardening. "Armored personnel carrier, military grade. They're not just coming to fight, they're coming to lay siege." She keyed her radio. "Marcus, be advised, target convoy includes APC, likely armed with heavy weapons. Adjust defensive positions accordingly." "Understood," Marcus replied. "We've got anti-armor capabilities in place. Just say the word." Sarah turned to Eduardo. "This is it. Delgado's committing everything he has left. If we stop him here, we end it," Eduardo finished, "once and for all." The next hour was spent fine-tuning their preparations. Additional weapons were distributed, firing positions double-checked, escape routes confirmed. Sarah moved through it all with cold efficiency, the warrior she'd once been fully emerged. "Convoy has turned onto the access road," Eduardo reported. 15 minutes out." Sarah checked her weapons one final time. "All teams, final positions. Remember, let them commit fully before engaging. We want them too deep to retreat when we spring the trap." She felt Eduardo's hand on her shoulder and turned to face him. In his eyes, she saw not fear, but absolute trust and determination. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "I want you to know that I'm proud to fight beside you. The woman I married, the warrior you are, they're both part of who you are. And I love all of you." Sarah pulled him close for a brief, fierce kiss. "Stay alive," she whispered. "That's an order." The distant rumble of engines grew louder as Delgado's convoy approached. Sarah took her position at the command center, watching as multiple screens showed the cartel forces moving into position. "All teams report ready." Marcus's voice came through clear and professional. Sarah took a deep breath, 20 years of combat experience crystallizing into this moment. "Remember your training," she broadcast to all teams. "We are not the prey here. We are the hunters, and tonight we show them why." The first vehicles appeared on the main approach, their headlights cutting through the darkness like spears. Sarah watched them advance, her finger resting lightly on the command detonator. "Let them come," she whispered. "Let them all come." The trap was set. The hunters were ready, and Sarah Martinez, La Fantasma, prepared to remind the cartel why. Some legends are best left undisturbed. The final battle was about to begin. Delgado's convoy rolled steadily toward the ranch, their vehicles spread out in textbook assault formation. Sarah watched through the command center's displays as the APC took the lead, its heavy armor presenting an imposing silhouette in the darkness. "All units hold," she commanded through the tactical net. "Wait for my signal." The cartel forces had learned from their previous assault. Their vehicle spacing was perfect, minimizing the effectiveness of explosive ambushes. Snipers could be seen taking elevated positions, while support teams moved to cut off potential escape routes. "They're almost at the first trigger point," Eduardo reported, monitoring the thermal imaging display. "I count at least 40 personnel, all heavily armed." Sarah nodded, her fingers dancing across the tactical console. "Marcus, status of your teams, in position and ready," came the immediate response. "Anti-armor units have clear shots on the APC. Just say the word." The convoy reached the outer perimeter of the ranch, and Sarah could see Delgado himself through the thermal imaging, a figure in the lead SUV surrounded by bodyguards. Everything was proceeding exactly as she'd planned. "Commence Operation Ghostwalker," she ordered. "Execute on my mark." The cartel forces continued their advance, unaware that they were driving into one of the most elaborate traps ever conceived. Sarah had spent days planning this, using every lesson learned from 20 years of combat experience. 3, 2, 1, mark. The first phase began silently. Hidden EMP devices activated, temporarily disabling the cartel's communications, and night vision equipment. In the sudden electronic darkness, confusion spread through their ranks. "Second phase, execute," Sarah commanded. Powerful spotlights blazed to life, strategically placed to blind and disorient the attackers. Simultaneously, Marcus's teams opened up with precision fire, targeting the APC's tracks and the engines of key vehicles. The night erupted in chaos. The APC's main gun roared, firing blindly at suspected positions, but Sarah had anticipated this. Her forces were positioned in hardened bunkers or behind multiple layers of cover. "Eduardo, target their command vehicle," she ordered. "Marcus, collapse their flanks." Eduardo's shot was perfect, disabling Delgado's SUV with a single round. Through the engine block, the cartel boss and his bodyguards scrambled for cover as coordinated fire from multiple positions caught them in a deadly crossfire. "They're trying to fall back," Marcus reported, moving to cut off their retreat. But Sarah had expected this too. Hidden barriers emerged from the ground, blocking the access road. The cartel forces were trapped in a killing zone of her design. "All units, execute Phase 3, she commanded. The real assault began. Marcus's teams attacked from multiple directions, using their superior night-fighting capabilities and coordination to devastating effect. The cartel forces, their usual tactical discipline shattered, began to break up into smaller groups. "Delgado's moving," Eduardo called out, heading for the disabled APC with a security team. Sarah switched to a direct channel to Marcus. "Take out that APC now." 3 anti-tank missiles streaked through the night, striking the armored vehicle in rapid succession. The resulting explosion illuminated the battlefield like daylight, sending cartel gunmen diving for cover. "Push the advantage," Sarah ordered. "Don't let them regroup." Her forces moved with practiced precision, years of training evident in every action. The cartel fighters, despite their numbers and weaponry, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. "Delgado's surrounded," Marcus reported. "No escape routes left." Sarah keyed her radio to all channels. "Victor Delgado, your forces are defeated, your escape cut off. Surrender now, or this ends only one way." For a moment, only the sound of sporadic gunfire filled the night. Then a voice responded, thick with rage and desperation. "You think this ends here, Puta?" Delgado shouted. "I am not so easy to kill." The cartel boss emerged from cover, firing wildly with an automatic weapon. But Sarah had been counting on his pride, his need to go down fighting rather than surrender. "Eduardo," she said quietly, "take the shot." A single crack split the night. Delgado spun and fell, not dead but wounded, his weapon flying from his grasp. As if this was a signal, the remaining cartel forces began throwing down their weapons. "All units secure the survivors," Sarah ordered. "Medical treatment for those who need it, then into custody. This ends tonight." She watched through the cameras as Marcus's teams moved in, efficiently disarming and securing the cartel members. Delgado was quickly surrounded, his wound being treated even as he was restrained. "Federal authorities are 10 minutes out," Eduardo reported. "They're bringing multiple agencies, heavy response teams." Sarah nodded, finally allowing herself to relax slightly. "Good. Let them handle the aftermath. Our part is done." She felt Eduardo's hand on her shoulder and turned to face him. His eyes were clear, his expression proud despite the violence they'd just orchestrated. "It's over?" he asked softly. Sarah looked at the tactical displays, at the defeated cartel forces being led away, at the man who had threatened their home, now in custody. "This part is," she replied, "but there will be others. As long as we have something worth protecting, there will always be those who want to take it." Eduardo smiled, pulling her close. "Then we'll be ready. Together." As the sound of approaching federal helicopters filled the air, Sarah Martinez held her husband, watching as their ranch, their home, slowly emerged from the shadows of combat back into the light of dawn. They had faced the darkness together, and together they had prevailed. 1 month after the final battle, the Martinez Ranch had begun to heal. Bullet holes were patched, damaged structures rebuilt, and the signs of combat gradually erased. But the changes ran deeper than mere physical repairs. Sarah stood on their porch at sunrise, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching as Eduardo worked. With Marcus's security team, her husband moved through tactical drills with surprising grace, his rancher's strength now honed with professional training. "He's a natural," Marcus commented, joining her on the porch. "Never seen anyone pick up combat skills so quickly." Sarah nodded, pride evident in her expression. "He's adapted to this life better than I ever expected. Sometimes I wonder if he had a warrior's heart all along, just waiting for the right moment to emerge." The ranch had become something new, a fortress, yes, but also a training facility. After Delgado's capture and the cartel's collapse, other ranchers had approached them, seeking protection and knowledge. Sarah found herself teaching again, passing on the skills she'd tried so hard to forget. "Latest intelligence report," Marcus said, handing her a tablet. "Federal authorities have rounded up most of Delgado's remaining network. Rivera's testimony proved invaluable. He gave them everything." "And Delgado himself?" "Multiple life sentences, no possibility of parole. He's being held in a maximum security facility under 24-hour watch. The cartel's finished." Sarah sipped her coffee, watching as Eduardo demonstrated a firing stance to a group of neighboring ranchers. "And the others? The rival cartels looking to move into the territory?" "They're keeping their distance," Marcus replied with a slight smile. "The story of La Fantasma has spread. No one's eager to test the legend of the rancher's wife who brought down Los Salvajes." A helicopter appeared on the horizon, another group of trainees arriving for Sarah's advanced defensive tactics course. The Martinez Ranch had become a symbol of resistance, a place where ordinary people learned to defend their homes and their way of life. "I never wanted this," Sarah mused. "When I left the service, I thought I could just disappear, become someone else. And now?" She smiled. watching Eduardo confidently correct a trainee's grip on a rifle. Now I realize you can't run from who you are. Sometimes the best thing you can do is embrace it, use it to protect what matters. Marcus nodded toward the arriving helicopter. These people need you, need what you know. Maybe this is why you ended up here, why all of this happened. The morning's training session began in earnest. Sarah watched as Eduardo led his group through basic combat movements, his voice carrying the same quiet authority she'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. But now that authority was backed by hard-won experience and tactical knowledge. "We've got visitors," Marcus noted, indicating an approaching convoy of government vehicles. Sarah recognized the lead SUV. Federal agents, probably with more questions about the cartel's operation. She'd spent weeks helping them unravel Delgado's network, using her knowledge to ensure the organization could never rebuild. "I'll handle it," she said, setting down her coffee. "Eduardo has things under control here." As if hearing his name, her husband looked up and caught her eye. They shared a moment of silent communication, love, trust, and understanding flowing between them. He nodded once, then returned to his instruction. Sarah walked down to meet the federal agents, her movement still carrying the deadly grace of a trained operator. But now that grace was tempered with purpose, with the knowledge that her skills served something greater than just survival. "Mrs. Martinez," the lead agent greeted her, "we have some new developments we'd like to discuss." "Of course," she replied, leading them toward the command center. "But first, tell me, how are the border patrols working out? Any activity from the smaller cartels?" "Nothing significant. Your defensive strategies have been remarkably effective. In fact, that's partly why we're here." Sarah listened as they walked, noting how naturally she now moved between her roles. Warrior, teacher, protector. The woman who had tried to escape her past had found a way to embrace it instead, using it to build something meaningful. Later that evening, as the sun set over their transformed ranch, Sarah and Eduardo stood together on their porch. The days. Trainees had departed, leaving behind a sense of purpose and progress. "Do you ever regret it?" Eduardo asked softly. "Staying to fight instead of running?" Sarah turned to face her husband, seeing in his eyes the same strength that had helped her through the darkest days of their ordeal. "Never," she replied. "This is who we are now, who we were always meant to be." He pulled her close, and together they watched the desert darkness settle over their home. The Martinez Ranch had become more than just a refuge. It was a beacon of hope, a place where people learned to stand and fight for what they believed in. And at its heart stood a former operative who had finally found her true purpose, and the rancher who had proved that the heart of a warrior could be found in the most unexpected places. Their story had become legend along the border, whispered in cantinas and ranch houses, the tale of La Fantasma and the rancher who stood against a cartel and won. But for Sarah and Eduardo Martinez, it was simply their life, their love, their destiny. Together they had built something extraordinary, and together they would defend it come what may.